March 20th, 1945, Remagen, Germany. The frost hadn't yet lifted when Corporal Tom Reilly stepped into the churned mud of a field that no longer belonged to anyone. The ground was hard under his boots, thin layers of ice webbing between footprints and shell craters. Around him, the Rhine Valley exhaled smoke and silence, the kind that comes after something enormous has broken. He stopped near a collapsed fence post, looking at the earth as if trying to remember what to do with it. A Kansas boy, raised among wheat and wind, Reilly had grown up believing soil was meant for life, not trenches. But now the same soil lay heavy with wire, ration tins, and the bitter smell of diesel. Beyond the fog, the half-ruined Ludendorff Bridge stretched across the Rhine, its skeletal arches still trembling from the bombings days earlier. Engineers swarmed over it, hammering planks, running cables, shouting orders that faded into the morning wind. The bridge had given the Americans passage into Germany, and with it, something else. Tens of thousands of German prisoners herded like shadows into open fields along the riverbank. Reilly had been reassigned from combat duty to guard detail. No more firefights, no more towns taken and retaken, just fences, lists, and watch rotations. But what the orders didn't mention was the look in the prisoners' eyes. Young faces, some no older than 17, sunken with fatigue, gray with hunger, uniforms torn and ill-fitting. Some still carried photographs, others only their dog tags. He walked past rows of new wire fencing that cut the field into pens. The prisoners stood silently, wrapped in whatever blankets they had left, steam rising from their breath in the cold. A few tried to warm their hands over tin cans filled with burning straw. A guard nearby spat into the mud and muttered, "They sure don't look like the monsters from the newsreels." Reilly didn't answer. He just watched. The prisoners were not the war. They were what was left of it. Behind him, a truck rattled to a stop. An officer climbed down, unrolled a map, and started barking orders about rations and boundaries. The camp was to expand. More men were coming from the bridgehead every hour. There was no proper shelter, no kitchen, no beds. The Rhine meadow camps were meant to be temporary, but nothing about them felt short-lived. Reilly's hands were raw from cold, his uniform damp from the mist. He looked down again at the field, the churned mess of roots and frozen earth. Somewhere under all this mud, he thought, there might still be seeds from last year's harvest, buried too deep to die. A German prisoner, his face gaunt but eyes clear, noticed Reilly watching the ground. The man knelt, scooped up a handful of dirt, and held it out through the wire. He said nothing, just offered it, like a gesture older than language. Reilly hesitated. Then, quietly, he reached out and accepted it. For a second, neither of them moved. The frost was melting between their palms, a thin trail of mud running down Reilly's wrist. A whistle blew. The moment ended. The German turned back into the line, and Reilly tucked his hand into his pocket, feeling the cold weight of that soil. Later that night, when the camp lights flickered out and the river's sound filled the silence, he would take it out again, that small clump of earth, and think of home. He didn't know it yet, but this field, this no-man's land between victory and mercy, was about to become something else entirely. Morning came gray and restless. The fog rolled low over the Rhine, carrying with it the smell of damp straw, wood smoke, and fear. The camp was growing faster than anyone could manage. Fences extended each day, a web of barbed wire stretching over what had once been farmland. The men called it the cage. Corporal Reilly's shift began before sunrise. His breath hung in the cold air as he walked the perimeter, counting prisoners by the hundreds. They stood shoulder to shoulder, quiet, waiting for something that never quite came. Food, news, forgiveness. The official orders were clear: minimal contact, strict control, and no fraternization. The war in Europe wasn't over, not officially, and these prisoners were still classified as enemy personnel. The Geneva Convention was to be respected, but the supply lines were thin and the rations thinner. In truth, mercy had to be measured, like coffee, like bullets. At the officer's tent, Reilly overheard a conversation. "We can't feed them all," one lieutenant said. "HQ says to conserve supplies. They'll get whatever's left over from the troops." "They're lucky to be alive," another replied. The words were practical, but Reilly heard something else beneath them: exhaustion disguised as authority. He returned to the wire and watched a line of prisoners kneeling to drink from puddles left by last night's rain. One of them coughed hard, doubled over, then laughed quietly to himself. It was a strange sound, not bitterness, but disbelief that life still continued in a place like this. That night, Reilly sat with a mess tin of watery soup, staring at the faint reflection of his face. He remembered his father's voice from years ago during a drought back home. "You don't curse the sky when it forgets you, son. You just keep your hands in the soil until it remembers." Here, though, there was no soil, just mud, the kind that clung to your boots and didn't let go. He started keeping a small notebook, its pages damp and smudged. Not official reports, just notes to himself. The wire hums when the wind changes direction. They build fires from scraps of fence posts. One boy hums the same song every night, sounds like a lullaby. The entries became his quiet protest against forgetting. A week later, the first rumors spread through the camp that prisoners were dying of exposure in other enclosures downriver, near Sinzig and Bad Kreuznach. The MPs said it was exaggeration. The Red Cross said it was under control, but Reilly saw the hollowed faces in front of him and knew better. That evening, while the officers discussed rations, he wandered back to the same patch of field where the German prisoner had handed him soil. The ground was softer now, thawing with the season. The mud had the faint scent of life again, of spring daring to return where war had passed. He knelt and pressed his fingers into the dirt. The texture felt familiar, coarse, real, forgiving. Behind him, the sound of footsteps. A fellow guard, Private Lewis, whispered, "You thinking of planting something, farmer boy?" Reilly didn't look up. "Maybe," he said. "Seems the ground's trying to forget what it's seen." Lewis shook his head. "Forget? You think dirt forgets?" Reilly paused. "No, but it forgives easier than people." The next morning he was assigned to the ration line again, counting prisoners by hand, marking down portions that never seemed enough. The German boy who'd offered him soil days earlier shuffled past, thinner now, his lips cracked from cold. He met Reilly's eyes but didn't speak. He didn't have to. That night, Reilly wrote a final line in his notebook before lights out. "If victory means watching men starve, then maybe I've forgotten what we were fighting for." Outside, the river murmured against the stones, indifferent and endless. Somewhere in the dark, a prisoner began humming again. The same song, the same haunting tune. Reilly listened until sleep took him, the melody blending with the wind that pushed against the wire. The fracture had begun, not in orders or in battle, but inside him, where duty and decency no longer spoke the same language. By early April, the camp had settled into a grim rhythm, a machine of exhaustion that ran on orders and silence. Morning roll call, bread ration, work detail, count again. Lights out. It was life reduced to repetition, and yet, inside that sameness, something human began to stir. The prisoners had started digging drainage trenches along the fence line. It wasn't an official task. The ground had turned to muck after every rainfall, and they'd decided to do something about it. A young guard might have seen defiance in the act. Reilly saw something else, men trying to reclaim a fragment of purpose. One afternoon, while patrolling near the southern perimeter, he stopped to watch them work. A prisoner with gray in his beard, perhaps a farmer before the war, was carving neat rows in the mud with a broken plank. The man's movements were deliberate, almost peaceful. As he worked, a rhythm emerged, joined by others, scraping, patting, shaping earth that no one believed could bear fruit again. Reilly crouched beside the wire. "What are you doing?" he asked. The German looked up, then down at the furrows. "Erde lebt," he said softly. "The earth lives." The guard beside Reilly frowned. "What did he say?" Reilly shrugged. "Doesn't matter. I think I get it." That night, after his shift, Reilly walked into the nearby village of Kripp under pretense of checking supplies. Most shops were abandoned. A few barns still held seed grain left over from the harvest before the war turned west. He found an old woman sweeping the threshold of what had once been a feed store. She looked at him with suspicion until he pulled a ration chocolate from his pocket. In broken German, he asked for seeds, any kind. Barley, potatoes, cabbage. She stared for a long moment, then nodded. "For the prisoners?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer, just pressed the chocolate into her palm. By the next morning, Reilly returned with a small sack hidden under his jacket. He told no one. He just walked to the same stretch of field where the trenches had been dug and scattered the first handful of seeds into the thawing soil. The work spread quickly. Within days, the prisoners understood. No words were needed. They began clearing patches, shaping rows, organizing tools out of scrap metal and spoons. The camp commander ignored it at first, assuming it kept them occupied. But for the men, both guard and prisoner, the act meant something deeper. It was defiance without anger, creation in the shadow of ruin. Reilly began to join them during his rounds, checking the soil, adjusting rows. When questioned by a superior, he said only that he was preventing erosion. The officer raised an eyebrow, then moved on. The field slowly transformed. Tiny shoots began to appear in late April, faint green against the gray mud. Every morning, Reilly found the prisoners standing in silence before them, as though attending a service. One of them, a former teacher, started keeping a crude journal, marking each sprout with a line of charcoal on the barrack wall. When it rained, the prisoners covered the seedlings with torn canvas. When the sun came, they carried water from the river in mess tins. At night, Reilly sat by the fence, writing in his notebook again. "They don't look like enemies anymore, just men watching something grow." The camp began to change in ways no one could explain. The guards grew quieter, the prisoners more disciplined, arguments less frequent. The barbed wire still divided them, but it no longer defined them. Then one morning, a Red Cross liaison visited and noted the small garden near the perimeter. She paused, astonished. "Who authorized this?" she asked. Reilly said, "The ground did." She smiled, faintly, tiredly, and walked away. Weeks later, the first vegetables sprouted fully, small, imperfect, alive. The smell of fresh earth drifted through the camp, mingling with the constant odor of wet canvas and unwashed clothes. It was the scent of something no one had expected to find here: renewal. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the Rhine, Reilly saw the same German prisoner who'd first handed him soil, kneeling beside the plants. The man looked up, met his eyes, and smiled for the first time. No words passed between them. None were needed. The war was still raging miles away, But here, for one fleeting season, mercy had found a place to grow. By May, the Rhine Valley had turned green again. The air smelled faintly of river water and young crops, but inside the wire that scent was both promise and danger. What had started as quiet mercy had become visible, and visibility in war was risk. The little camp farm, rows of barley, cabbage, and potatoes sprouting in straight military lines, had begun to draw attention. Officers passing through on inspection stopped to stare, then frown. They saw something they didn't have a rule for. One afternoon, Captain Hensley arrived from division headquarters. Tall, pressed uniform, clipboard under his arm, the kind of man who measured compassion against efficiency. Reilly stood at attention as the captain surveyed the field. "Who authorized this agricultural experiment?" Hensley asked. Reilly hesitated. "It just sort of happened, sir. Men needed work. The soil was there." "The soil," Hensley repeated, unimpressed. "We're running a containment camp, Corporal." Not a 4-H club. He ordered the guards to dismantle the plots by evening. Reilly saluted, but his jaw tightened. When Hensley left, the other guards looked at Reilly, waiting for a decision. He walked the perimeter, stopped by the wire, and looked across at the prisoners kneeling beside their crops. Their faces were blank, unreadable, but their hands never stopped working. Reilly didn't give the order. He simply said, "Leave it be." That night, the air thickened with unease. The guards whispered about insubordination, the prisoners about loss, but no one moved. By dawn, Reilly stood alone near the rows, watching dew bead on the young barley. He thought of Kansas, of his father planting in the dust storms of '34, saying, "If you can't save the land, you don't deserve the harvest." When Captain Hensley returned 2 days later, he found the garden intact, larger even. He called Reilly into the command tent. "You're one step from a court-martial," he said. Reilly didn't flinch. "Sir, they're working, not rebelling. They're growing food for the camp, for us too." Hensley's eyes narrowed. "That's not your decision." Reilly's reply came quiet, steady. "No, sir, it's my conscience." The captain stared at him for a long moment, then signed the inspection sheet without comment. He left the camp that afternoon and never mentioned the farm again. The garden continued. Something began to change between the men. Not friendship, not forgiveness, but an unspoken treaty. The guards started trading salt and soap for vegetables. A German prisoner built a scarecrow from old uniforms. Another carved small crosses from fence wood and stuck them at the ends of rows. Each morning Reilly walked the field, boots damp with dew, the smell of life mixing with the metallic scent of wire. He rarely spoke, just nodded to the prisoners, who nodded back. In his notebook, he wrote, "Mercy isn't weakness. It's heavier than a rifle, but it steadies the hand better." The paradox deepened. He was obeying no order, yet holding the camp together more tightly than any regulation ever could. War had trained him to take life. Here, he was learning how to give it back. Still, unease lingered. Some guards resented the quiet. "You're getting too close," they told him. "They'll forget who's in charge." But Reilly knew. The men inside the wire hadn't forgotten. They bowed their heads every night before sleep, facing the fields, not the guards. To them, the earth itself had become the truce. By early June, a rumor reached the camp that the war in Europe was over. The officers cheered. The prisoners didn't react. Reilly saw only confusion in their faces. Liberation for some, uncertainty for others. The war was ending, but captivity wasn't. And for Reilly, the paradox remained. He had followed his orders to the letter. to guard them, feed them, prevent escape. Yet the act of mercy that disobeyed those same orders was what kept them alive. At dusk, as the sun dipped behind the Rhine, he walked one last patrol along the wire. The fields shimmered gold, the plants brushing lightly against the fence. He stopped and placed his palm on the cold metal. On the other side, the German farmer did the same. No words, just two hands separated by law, joined by soil. That night, Reilly couldn't sleep. The farm had become too real, too visible. He knew what came next. Every miracle had its inspection. By late June, the fields had ripened into color. Bright patches of green and gold spread like defiance across the gray mud of Remagen. From the air, it must have looked like an ordinary farm. On the ground, it was a quiet act of rebellion, one born not from politics, but from conscience. But in war, even mercy attracts scrutiny. The telegram came one humid morning. A senior Allied inspection team was to tour the Rhine camps. There were whispers of mismanagement and unauthorized deviations. The guards cleaned rifles, the officers pressed uniforms, and everyone pretended they didn't know what would be found beyond the perimeter. Reilly didn't need to be told. He saw the fear on the faces of the prisoners. They knew that their small patch of green might cost them everything. The crops had become their proof of dignity. The inspection could erase it overnight. That evening, the sky broke open with rain, the kind that floods quickly, angrily. The camp turned to slush. Reilly ran toward the field and saw the Germans already there, knee-deep in mud, trying to save what they could. Barley stalks bent under the weight of water. Canvas sheets flapped loose in the wind. He shouted orders, not as a guard, but as a farmer. "Cover the roots. Drain the low rows first." His voice vanished in the storm. For hours, men on both sides of the wire worked together, indistinguishable under the downpour. Soldiers, captives, all covered in the same mud, driven by the same instinct to preserve life. Lightning tore the sky open. In its flash, Reilly saw one of the younger prisoners, the boy who always hummed songs at night, slip in the flooded trench. Without thinking, Reilly dropped his rifle, crossed the wire gap, and dragged him out by the shoulders. The boy's face was pale, his breath ragged. They collapsed side by side in the rain, chest to chest, gasping for air. The other guards froze, unsure whether to intervene, but no one moved. By dawn, the rain had passed. The field lay wounded, rows flattened, seedlings washed away. The boy lay in the infirmary tent, feverish but alive. Reilly sat beside him until sunrise. Captain Hensley arrived that morning for inspection. His boots sank into the mud. He looked at the ruined field, then at Reilly, soaked, filthy, unshaven. "This was your farm?" he asked quietly. Reilly nodded. "It's gone now." "Yes, sir. You disobeyed direct orders." "I did what I had to." The captain studied him for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he sighed. "You saved more men than you were told to guard," he said, almost to himself. He turned and left. No charges were filed. Days later, the sun returned. The prisoners began to replant, not because they were ordered to, but because it felt wrong to stop. Reilly helped them, even when his shift ended. He noticed that some of the destroyed crops had survived, thin blades pushing through the mud, persistent, impossible. One afternoon, after roll call, Reilly found a small bundle on his cot, a piece of brown paper tied with twine. Inside, wrapped in linen, was a single loaf of bread baked from the surviving grain. No note, no name. Only that small gesture left by men who had nothing else to give. He tore it in half, shared it with Private Lewis, and said nothing. That night, the camp was quiet. The river's sound filled the air like breathing. Reilly sat at the edge of the field, notebook open, rain still clinging to its pages. He wrote, "They gave me bread from the ground I helped them keep. I don't know if that's mercy or confession, but I'll remember it longer than any victory." The war was ending, but what had taken root here, in the soil, in the silence between enemies, would not wash away so easily. He closed the notebook, looked out across the wire, and for the first time since arriving, felt the ground beneath him breathe. August 1945. The heat sat heavy over the Rhine, pressing down on tents and wire until everything shimmered. News drifted through the camp like a rumor. Germany had surrendered months ago. Japan was finished now, too. The world was starting over. The prisoners lined up as usual, but their faces were different, calmer, emptier. They were no longer enemy combatants, only men waiting for papers, trucks, and trains. A few smiled faintly when they were told they'd soon be going home, but most just nodded. Home, after all, had become an uncertain word. The American farm, as locals had begun to call it, still stood, though half its rows were bare. What remained was enough, green against the gray ruins, proof that something human had survived, the long months between surrender and forgiveness. Corporal Tom Reilly received orders to pack up within the week. He folded his uniform carefully, polished his boots until he could see the reflection of the camp fence in them, then stopped halfway through and set the rag down. That afternoon he walked one last patrol of the perimeter. The same prisoner who had first offered him soil months earlier was among those waiting by the trucks. The man raised a hand in silent acknowledgement. Reilly nodded once in return. Nothing needed to be said. Their words had already been planted. When the convoy pulled out, the field shimmered under the sun. American guards, German prisoners, and villagers who had drifted back to their homes all watched the land quietly, as if waiting for something else to grow there. A week later, Reilly was on a transport heading west through France, then across the Atlantic. The hum of the ship's engines blended with the wind off the deck. Steady. Endless. He opened his notebook, pages softened from rain and handling, and read the lines he'd written in the camp. His handwriting had changed. Smaller, quieter, like a man who had seen too much and learned to say less. He tucked the notebook away, reached into his duffel, and found the small cloth pouch he'd kept since Remagen. Inside it was a pinch of that same Rhine soil, still dark and damp even after all these weeks. When the ship neared the New York harbor, the skyline rising gray through the mist, Reilly thought of Kansas, of open fields, late harvests, and the sound of dry stalks brushing against each other in the wind. He imagined stepping off the train, walking into his father's fields, and pressing that foreign soil into American ground. He did. By October, the war was already fading from radio broadcasts. Reilly worked alone most mornings, sowing rows before dawn. The soil in Kansas was drier than the Rhine's, pale dust that clung to his skin. He poured the last of the Rhine earth into the first furrow and covered it gently with his boot. That winter the crops came in strong, maybe coincidence, maybe memory. He never spoke of it. At the county fair the following year, someone asked him if he'd ever been stationed in Germany. He paused, then simply said, "Once, long enough to learn how hard it is to grow anything in someone else's soil." At night he would sit on the porch, listening to the insects hum in the fields. Sometimes he thought of the men behind the wire, of the bread, the storm, the green shoots rising where none should have grown. He didn't dream of combat anymore, only of earth, of hands working side by side, of rain washing away footprints until no one could tell who had been prisoner and who had been guard. The war was over, but its echo still lived beneath his fields, a quiet reminder that mercy once planted never truly dies. The Rhine shimmered again that spring, not with the movement of troops, but with the stillness of memory. The war had been over for years now, yet every plowed field still seemed to carry its ghosts. Locals called it Die Amerikanische Farm. Children played near the riverbank where the wire had once stood. The earth was rich there, darker than the fields around it. When old men spoke of the harvest, they did so in half-whispers, not of victory, but of the years strangers shared their soil. A generation later, a historian from Bonn found a small packet in the city archives labeled Remagen, Camp B, 1945. Inside was a faded photograph, a group of men standing ankle-deep in mud, one of them wearing an American uniform with rolled sleeves. Behind them, rows of crops and barbed wire blurred together in the haze. The caption read only, "The Garden." He traced the names listed on the back. One was Thomas Reilly, U.S. Army, Kansas. The historian mailed a copy of the photograph to the County Historical Society in Topeka. They filed it quietly under agricultural exchange, post-war Europe, unaware that the man in the picture had once stood between obedience and compassion and chosen both. Decades passed. The field near Remagen became part of a local cooperative. Tourists walking along the Rhine sometimes stopped to look at the sign the town had placed there. Site of the American Garden, 1945, where enemies shared one harvest. The words were simple, but the ground beneath them felt alive. In Kansas, Riley's notebook ended up in a wooden box in the attic after his death. His granddaughter found it years later, the pages brittle, the ink faded but still legible. She read his final entry, written in a careful, tired hand. The soil remembers everything. The boots, the hunger, the mercy. We fed them because we could, because if we hadn't, the ground would have kept their silence instead. On her next trip to Europe, she took a handful of that Kansas dirt and pressed it into the soil near Remagen, beneath the sign. The air that day was still. The Rhine moved with its usual patience, the same river that had once carried wreckage and redemption in equal measure. Somewhere beyond the fields, a church bell rang, faint, slow, almost like breathing. The wind carried dust across the old farmland, settling between blades of grass that had once been rows of barley. And for a brief moment, if you stood there quietly enough, you could almost hear it. The rustle of work-worn hands, the hum of a forgotten song, the faint whisper of soil being turned over by men who had finally remembered how to live. Then, as always, silence.